Hello and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, the podcast about the ancient classical world, where we tell you stuff you should know.
Oh, that's good. Ancient classical world, except when we don't want to talk about the ancient classical world.
That's true. Or where we spend 2.5 hours talking about the Middle Ages.
The classical Middle Ages.
That's
classical.
So this is a good point. And this has been brought to our attention a couple of times, that we are a podcast that doesn't just talk about the ancient Greece and Rome, which is what lots of people think when they hear classical. So anyway, my name is Graham Donaldson, and I am joined here today, as always, with the ombudsman of fun, Thomas Magby.
Hello.
And with AJ.
Not me.
He doesn't get a title?
I have a Snickers in my mouth.
He's eating. I wanted to get him to have to talk before he finished swallowing his Snickers.
Poor guy.
What is your actual title? Dean of Student Life.
Dean of Student Life. Yeah.
I like ombudsman of fun. Dispenser of mirth is also a good one.
Has anyone ever called me that before?
Right now.
You just
it's recorded.
Made it up. Okay,
it's
good.
happening.
I like that.
And we are teachers. We teach at Veritas Academy, which is a classical Christian school in Austin, Texas. And boys, it is summer.
Yeah.
It is glorious, glorious summer.
I have graduations tonight, so this is our last day. We're recording this on our last day.
That's right. There is a
schoolish,
palpable excitement in the air. We are sitting in a room covered in dust and boxes because Veritas Academy is moving from our home for the past, how many years have we been here?
Long time.
Long time.
Oh, man. If you count the elementary school before we moved over from Bannockburn, it was, I don't know, 9 years?
But these portables have been 6 because we just got them when I started here. Anyway, we are moving to our own shining new building about just a couple miles away, and everyone's super excited. Anyway, but today, Magby is going to crack eggs of wisdom all over this podcast.
What?
And
everything is an omelet metaphor with him.
Yeah, I've noticed this.
What do you got for us there, Magby?
So I guess this is following in the tradition of way too late in the length of this podcast asking like really basic questions about what the heck we're talking about. And so the topic for today is classical education.
Well, that's fun because my next topic is what is a podcast. So
I would actually love that episode.
I'm not kidding.
And mine is going to be technical explanations of microphones.
Yes.
I might sleep
a
through
long,
that one.
lengthy list of parts.
Sounds super interesting. Okay, so many episodes ago, I think it might have been the first one when I came on the podcast, was asking what is classical. Do you all remember any of those definitions?
We had just hired you. So, I mean, you were legitimately asking the question. As
guys, what is this classical thing about?
So, I got this job at the school.
I promise I've been working here for a year.
Did you say we hired him?
Yeah. Graham and AJ hired me.
I thought you meant on the podcast.
No, when the school hired him.
Didn't realize that.
He's been waiting for his paycheck
for
forever.
a while.
Haven't we all?
Yeah.
So what is classical? Do you remember any of those 3 definitions?
Old, like ancient Greece and Rome.
Greece and Rome, yeah.
Coca-Cola Classic, so we got this new thing, but it's kind of like the old thing, but the old thing now needs to be differentiated from the new thing?
Yeah. So Greek, Roman, or Latin literature and art is one definition. That was the first one you're talking about. An exemplary standard would be a second one, so just a thing that it's an important idea, can be called a classic.
So when AJ has like a perfect day, and we say that is classic AJ.
Day, yeah.
That is classic AJ. It's like when he rock climbs and when he teaches an English class. And what would be like peak AJ, telos AJ day? Rock climbs, teaches an English class.
Don't eat breakfast.
Wait, what?
I never eat breakfast. So don't eat breakfast, come to school, have 3 cups of coffee. By lunch, I'm shaking. And then, teach some, climb some.
And then you're doing DJing a party
maybe?
at night. That's right.
DJ a little bit.
That's classic AJ right there.
You enjoy the DJ stuff that much? Like that would be part of your perfect day?
I think are we going for iconic or like my ideal day?
We're talking classic AJ.
Then DJing, yeah.
There you go.
Rock and roll. And then
No, it's very different than rock and roll.
And then the last one on there is relating to the first significant period of an area or study. So a classic period. Psychology is a relatively recent field. Early studies of psychology would be regarded as the classics of that study. So the first significant period of
classic
study.
rock.
Yep. Known for its significance, I guess?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take it.
What would be the era of classic rock? Oh, contentious.
I have no answer to this.
Depends on, we're talking
true.
80s?
I don't know. Really? You're going to like...
If you're going to say classic rock
Why are you
and
going to
roll...
do Buddy Holly like that?
If you're going to say classic rock and roll, I say 50s. If it's classic rock, then I think 80s.
Okay.
So those were the three definitions of classical that we talked about a while ago. But a phrase that we've thrown around a few times, but not addressed specifically, is classical education. Now,
shame on us.
On a previous episode, I said we've never done an episode on classical education, and the reply was, well, we talked about the trivium. And I think, this might just be me, and I would love for the two of you to disagree, I think that's comparable to a previous statement on the podcast when someone said, we've never discussed Aristotle. If I had said, well, we talked about Book 8 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Like,
fair.
We talked about Aristotle, but we didn't cover like the wholeness of Aristotle. And same with classical, that we often tie the trivium to it. I don't think it's the wholeness of classical education. Would you all disagree with that?
No, I would agree. When we talked about the trivium, we talked about the Dorothy Sayers like commencement speech, the Lost Tools of Learning.
Yep.
And that was like the speech that launched 1,000 schools.
Yep.
And a lot of people sort of use that speech as like the shorthand, like crib notes for what classical education is. And I think a lot of us just sort of, who are in the classical education world, kind of fall back on that speech and say classical education trivium.
Right. But
it's not it at all. That's not the entirety of it.
But let's follow that for a while. Okay. So we talked about Dorothy Sayers a while ago on the trivium redux remix. Yeah. Anyway, so that was the episode on that, and so you can go and listen to that. But the trivium originally is not the stages of development that we use now. Mm-hmm. What was the trivium originally? I think it was Graham, you did this episode.
It was 3 out of the 7 classes that you took, essentially. Yeah. You took 7 liberal arts, and 3 of them were grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Yeah.
Let's see how I can do this. Grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy.
Yeah. So they were you were studying grammar you were studying grammar, you were studying logic, you were studying rhetoric. They were formal. I'm trying to avoid using the word subject because that's not the right word for it, but I guess arts. You were studying...
Studies.
Yeah. You were studying...
They're formal studies.
Yeah. So each of them were each their own formal study. Well, then Dorothy Sayers looks at them and says, well, this trivium also applies to the development and growth of children, that as they grow up, they are following this grammar, logic, rhetoric paradigm. And so just a weird thing that causes me to think is that classical education is kind of formed on an old idea, but it's a very new interpretation of a very old idea.
Well, she's marrying the trivium with, for her time, modern child development psychology. She's marrying that together. And so, like, if she had given that speech in Latin to a bunch of people in the Middle Ages, they would have been like, no, children don't develop. They're just bad adults.
Right.
Which is kind of what the ancient understanding of a child is.
Yeah. So hers was like a new proposal of how to understand the development of children, because just like you were saying, psychology is this kind of new field. We're understanding the growth and development of children. And so instead of it being a modern sociological explanation, it's an attempt at an ancient explanation of how children grow up. But that's my fear of the trivium being the only way we would describe classical education, because the trivium is kind of a method, right? Like, I think there is more to classical education than just a different way that we split up the stuff we teach.
The trivium, I'd say, is both a method and a study, right? You can study grammar, but you can also have the grammar of any subject, right? Learning the basics of geometry, learning the basics of music.
Yeah.
And so it depends on, there's a little bit of ambiguity there, depending on what you're talking about. If I say I'm going to study grammar, I probably mean English grammar, right? But there's grammar for everything. And so it's, in the classical world, or at least classical education world, we vacillate between these two meanings.
Yes.
Right? The study of actual rhetoric, or the rhetorical expressive study of anything, right? The rhetoric of painting is
and maybe that and that's the tension I'm getting at, that the way of looking at the development of a child as that being the defining aspect of classical education is in the last 100 years, last 60 years, isn't it? Like, that's Dorothy Sayers.
And the way that we educate has changed so much from what it was back then, right? If you were wealthy, you could hire a teacher or send your kid to a teacher, and you specifically chose them. It usually wasn't like a school, right? If you sent them to the academy, you usually knew what teachers were poking around at the academy. Sure. And you might even try different teachers for different things. It was more of like a tutoring system, at least for a big chunk of it.
Sure. And I mean, but to follow on with that, it's also not just the wealthy. It was also only for men. Like if we're really looking at what the original model is.
Wealthy, leisurely, non-slaves.
Yeah.
So if we were a true classical school.
No. So the only point to make here is that there's more to it than the trivium. And so then let's explore what other differences are. So Graham, this was in your intro, that Veritas Academy is classical Christian university model. Trying to focus just on that classical aspect piece of it right now. So what else is different about teaching English here at a classical school than it would be teaching it elsewhere? What is different about that?
So, okay, if we're going with that classical education is not a methodology, because it's more than not only a methodology, it's more than that. So one way to look at it, and this is the way I think about it. So classical education also has, or all education has an implied anthropology.
There it is.
So all education has, at its beginning, a belief as to what a human person is.
And what are the ends of that?
And what are the ends of that person? So, and a belief as to sort of what is the best for a human person and how a human person receives or learns information. So this isn't a complete answer, but one way that that English is different here than in another place is the fundamental anthropology of a classical Christian school is that the human person is made in God's image, that the human person is an image bearer of God. And so that means that, and they have a human nature. And then to the Christian part of that, a human nature that has been broken by the fall.
Yeah.
So that is the driving methodology, the driving focus underneath how a thing is taught.
Yeah.
And then I don't want to go into, I mean, we can go into what are other sort of the predominant modern ways of understanding what a human person is, and then how to teach to that.
Maybe. The problem with talking about classical education, I guess we kind of just touched on it, is that it has to be modernized in some ways. So we're not just taking a Greek method from thousands of years ago and copying and pasting here in Austin, Texas. And so Dorothy Sayers' method is a piece of that modernization. So that's why much of what I'll be reading from today is also very modern, which just seems kind of funny in like looking up, calling it classical education, but the resources on it I feel are pretty modern.
Yeah, if we transported some of those ancient tutors from Plato's school in Athens and said, all right, you're teaching history today, they'd be,
what are you talking about?
Yeah,
because like the subjects didn't exist in the same way. So a thing I'll be reading from as we're going through this is from the Circe Institute. They have some resources on understanding what is classical. And so, Graham, you've got the first one, that classical educators have a high view of humanity. Mm-hmm. So
do we know why they call themselves the Circe Institute? I've never understood this.
I can look it up.
Hannibal, do you know?
Your next answer.
Circe was the goddess of sorcery, I mean, if they're referring to the Circe,
that's why
Circe is an acronym for Center for Independent Research on Classical Education.
Oh, it's an acronym.
And then they just were like, also it's for the Odyssey.
This is funny. A secondary acronym is Consulting and Integrated Resources for Classical Educators. They have two acronyms for the same. Wow.
And I can't help but think that Andrew Kern had some sort of influence on the whole naming process.
Yeah.
And if that's true, then he's a big lover of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah. Anyway, so it stands for something. I didn't know that. So they have some resources. So again, that first one, classical educators have
Veritas is an acronym for verily are righteous.
Our?
Where's the E?
There's an E there.
Oh.
Veritas. Not
Veritas. Verily either... I got nothing. Sorry.
Anyway, so
it was funnier in my head.
Having a high view of humanity, that a piece of what is happening in education is not just skill transfer, but it's the growing and developing into a full human.
Paideia.
Yes, paideia. But when you say paideia, how is paideia different from when I use the English word education? What's different between those two?
There is a sense of, well, if you wanted to take an extreme view of it, one is conditioning and one is like one is like child rearing. Yes. That's sort of the difference is that, and C.S. Lewis talks about this a little bit in The Abolition of Man, where he says when a Roman father teaches his son that dulce et decorum, that it is right and good, it is sweet and good to die for your country. He is doing that out of a place where he truly believes it, and he is transmuting manhood from himself to his child,
Yes.
versus a propagandist or somebody who says, it would be really good if we could create citizens who wanted to die for our country. Therefore, we're going to create a lesson conditioning them to think that dying for their country is a great idea.
Yeah.
Maybe you have the same ends, but one is done. I mean, one I don't know.
One acknowledges the human.
One acknowledges the human, and one sort of is treating the human like a machine.
Yes.
I was going to say you're pointing out. Well, I actually wrote down some of the ways that I think classical education is different from typical modern education, and one of those is that it attempts to stray away from industrialization, right? Rather than imparting skills to kids, rather than like saying, we need you to be able to do X, Y, and Z by the time you leave school. What we are trying to do is develop the whole person and give them the means to live freely. And so if that means good writing, understanding math, understanding science and the way things happen around them, then that's what we're trying to do, but not in such a way that we can say, okay, we've cranked out 400 kids, they can all write a decent thing, right? We're trying to make them free, not necessarily give them a skill.
And this has been pointed out by other people in the classical education world, so I did not invent this, but the school, the modern school, is set up in the way that a factory is set up. So there is no reason. So there's no real reason why students are in one room and then a bell rings and then they go down the assembly line to another room and then they get their history widget and then a bell rings and they go down the assembly line to their math room and they get their math widget, and then we've got a brand new minted 2018 rolling off the production line set of students. Like that came about in the 19th century because factories were super efficient and schools were like, well, we can be efficient too.
Yeah.
But when you think about, like, I think about this a lot. There is very big differences between, let's say, in my 10th grade class, 15-year-old girls and 15-year-old boys. Like, just in terms of development and maturity.
Sure.
There are these vast differences. And it's kind of this arbitrary thing that we have them go through class by ages. As opposed to by aptitude, where you, anyway, so then that is a way that, and so at Veritas, we have grades and they're by age, and we have classes and we don't have a bell, but we have, at the same time, everybody knows, our class has to be done no matter what we're doing at this time because it's time to move on to the next one. And then they go off. So, that's still a modern way that Veritas operates.
But it's not necessarily fair to say we should therefore chuck the whole thing, because I think it was much easier to have a single teacher when there wasn't so much to
600 students
teach.
Yeah.
When there was not the students, but the material. Like we have now 2,000 years extra history that they didn't have.
Whereas in ancient Greece, they didn't have any of that history kicking around.
I can tell you what happened 100 years ago and tell you some myths, and that was it, right? But the myth was also their English class, and they're just honestly, there wasn't as much to learn. We are victims of the vast depth of our knowledge and therefore specialization, right? You are learning history, and that has been a pet project of yours, right?
Yes.
I would love to be able to teach English and history myself, and then on top of that, maybe geometry. I always love geometry.
And dancing and archery and horseback riding and astronomy and
everything
wrestling.
that does it all. Exactly, but that's the thing is I am educated primarily in English. I did not take a whole lot of science classes in my 4-year, and so I would parents usually would rather have those go to one of our other teachers who spent his whole career in there. And so now it makes sense, right? Where we have such drastic specialization that we just can't dip our toes in everywhere. We actually kind of have to give a depth of knowledge that would require far more training than I think is feasible for individual teachers.
And it's very so I have this temptation where I just want to be like, what, public school is the worst, but it's not. I went to public school, it's great. And there are pieces of it where I agree that it's an industrialized model, but there is an efficiency in the system, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, is it? Is there some information that can be conveyed efficiently, and that's okay?
Oh yeah, totally.
And that's, I don't know.
And there are other accomplishments of the wide availability of education, right? We are more literate now than we ever have been in any time ever in history.
Yep.
More people know how to read and write. More people know how to speak more than one language, right? Those things are available to the masses when they were, like we said, only available to the wealthy males of the world,
Yep.
right? So there's something to be said for this.
We have to blend the
this
two.
method, right? Yeah, so there needs to be some sort of blending.
But I don't know. We're not talking about the university model piece now, but a thing that I love about the high school schedule is that it looks similar to a college schedule in that you'll have, an hour and a half class 2 times a week. But you don't a high school student will not have class back to back 7 to 4, whatever times is normal.
Yeah, for confused listeners, what Thomas is talking about is, so another part of our model at this school is called a university model. And we won't go too far into it, but suffice to say, it's kind of like a half homeschool, half classroom model. Our students are not on campus every day.
They're getting hollered at by their moms.
And they're at home, and so there is a component of education that is happening at home with a home teacher, and that's usually their mother or father at home. And then they come to class and they have their class. When they get to high school, the home teacher is no longer teaching them at home. They are teaching themselves at home, and they are on campus 5 days a week, but they are not having classes every hour of every day. There are these gaps.
Yeah. Which then gives opportunity for what you were just talking about. Like if there are these things they love, there's time to pursue it. There's time for that in the schedule. So that's another component of how our school's set up.
My question is, why aren't we playing quiz show with the different elements of classical education? Like you said, there were some in this Cersei.
Do you want to do this?
I feel like
he's 1 point ahead right now.
Have you been keeping track?
Yeah. He's only named one.
What was my point?
That the high view of humanity. I gave you points for that one.
Oh, okay, shoot.
And AJ, you have a long list.
So I listed them.
Hey, can I ask one question though?
Yeah.
So in your last answer, you talked about like a part of the education is making them free. Did you want to say more about that? Like, what do you mean by that?
Is this a guiding?
No, it's not. I don't think it's one. No.
It is a liberal education
but what does that mean?
To make men
liberal. Like free from what?
Free from. Oh man.
I don't know.
Free from I guess the confines that ignorance places upon a man, and given them the skills to approach any endeavor that seems worthy to them.
Yeah, that's good. So, do you want me to guide you because you're like really close to one of them?
Is it close enough to give me the point?
Yeah, sure. So,
eat it, Graham.
So you're tied. I don't know what that means. So another piece from what we were talking about of having that high view of humanity. Another important thing is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, which I feel like is a phrase that we say a lot. And I was hoping we could talk more about that. Maybe some thoughts on what wisdom and virtue are.
When I think about how education frees us, just to go back to AJ's thing for a second, one of the great examples that I can think of is vocabulary.
Sure.
And so vocabulary sounds like it's kind of this lame, boring thing. But if you've ever had that experience where you are sitting and you have a feeling or you have a thing that you want to convey, something that you have experienced or feel and you want to convey it and you just don't know the word for it, that is a kind of being bound. That is a kind of trapped. Oh, what's that word? I just don't know what that word. What I'm trying to say is, And if you have a limited vocabulary and then the only way that you can describe things is in like a binary, it's cool, I love it, I hate it, I love it, I hate it. And if that's the only thing that you have, eventually that is you are less free than somebody who can express the precise meaning or the precise feeling of something. So that's an example of one way of how education
or even
frees
just
you.
having one set of skills or one skill, right? You can feel trapped in a job and that's all you can do, and your only other option is to leave that job and find another one of the exact same type, right? A full liberal education gives you the ability to put your hand to any skill that seems necessary, or at least have the means to learn those skills.
Sure. Also the freedom from we talk about advertising a lot, but the freedom from tyranny, like the freedom to understand when you're being persuaded to and not give in to those, to be able to rise above that.
Or being cheated, right? I mean, in a pre-advertisement age, like you had to know when people were selling you just a load of snake oil, you know?
And I'm not sure, this might eventually get more to the Christian angle.
Unless you're buying snake oil.
In which case,
I mean,
you have some, enjoy
depends
it.
on the snake, I'd say.
And just adds a little bit to the dish. Just a little,
a little snake oil.
A little snake oil.
A little bite.
A little bite. Just a little sting.
So sad right now. But then that ultimate freedom is over the sinful tendencies in oneself, like that I don't have to give in to the evil desires that are within me. I can rise above those things. I mean, I don't know.
I'd say that's probably the moral component you were digging for, is that kind of thing. But I'd also say that sounds like a way to sell education to Christian parents, because classical education wasn't, like, it definitely addressed philosophy, but I would not necessarily say that it was always a fully moral education, right? We also have the sophists,
right,
whose their primary goal was to teach you how to basically cheat at arguing, and that is not a moral education, but it was an education that people paid for.
Yeah.
So we can't just say that all the ancients taught these wonderful moral things. I mean, every ancient taught something different. Epicurus taught that the end of man was pleasure, and the way to get to pleasure was by being virtuous. So his goal wasn't even virtue. His virtue was like individual happiness, and people mistook him for a hedonist, but he wasn't. He was something else. So I think that, that might be too easy to say that it's a moral education or a virtuous education when it didn't always teach virtue.
It's in most of the modern versions of classical education are tied with Christian. It's very rare to see classical not Christian.
That's true. I mean, there are still a lot of the sort of the British system still has like old classical hangovers. That's not necessarily Christian on them.
We've got one coming into Veritas that's not
coming into Austin.
Austin, yeah. Sorry, not Veritas. That would be strange.
Or even so.
That's true. There's a classical charter school opening up
in Norms and Nobility. What's the guy's name?
David Hicks.
David Hicks. Like his opening story is about how the English system has this classical education, but it has tended toward the same aristocracy that AJ was just talking about. That it's only certain kinds of people who get to have that education. And that hasn't been the case since Dorothy Sayers' essay, since kind of modern classical education, whatever that means. Okay.
Neoclassical.
That's a good word. I like that. She calls them the neoliberal arts was another one. She says neo-medieval studies. Anyway, Dorothy Sayers has another one in there. AJ, what else do you have? There are 2 or 3 more things that we're looking for.
Can I not play the game anymore?
Sure. Do you want to?
You don't have a list, Graham.
Seriously, you didn't come prepared, unlike some people. He came up with this list as he was sitting here. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
If he can't think of one, I have more.
Go for it, Adrian.
Great. Awesome.
So I also wrote down things that make classical education different is the material chosen.
Yeah.
So we tend towards material that has stood the test of time and is widely regarded as classical rather than jumping at new material that is lauded in only our modern age. And one of the reasons we do that is for all the reasons C.S. Lewis says that we should read old books, right? To keep ourselves from falling into the same pitfalls that happen when one society tends too far one direction.
Sure.
Right? So every age has its own problems. The best way to inoculate yourself against those problems is to read old books from societies that had their own problems, but problems that were different than yours. So material, our methodology is a little bit different. We tend towards the Socratic method more than just teaching. And I don't think that's totally fair to public education.
No, I did Socratic education in public.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that's exclusive to us.
But when you do a Socratic dialogue, like, is it just so everyone can say their opinions? Like, what is there a difference in how is there a different classical approach to a Harkness, to a group discussion? Yeah, is there a difference in group discussion for classical versus modern?
The Socratic dialogue should be where the teacher is asking questions that the students have to answer to get the students to discover the truth for themselves. So there's that Socratic irony where the teacher kind of pretends like he doesn't know the answer and sort of leads the student into understanding what that is.
So I find
that's different than just like everyone share their opinion time, which is what happened in my public school.
Right.
I find that sometimes a good way to lead a class, but then another good way is if you don't necessarily have a specific place you want them to end up and say, I want you to sort of poke around in this passage and find everything you can, they'll often get farther than I thought they were capable of, right? They'll pick the thing that I wanted them to get in the first 10 minutes and then go. That allows them to go as far as they can possibly go, and I think that is the advantage of the Socratic method is the students will go as far as their ability can take them rather than as far as I think they can go that day,
sure.
Which is the great difference. But there is something to be said for having, like, there are days when I'm like, I want them to arrive at this certain place and I will drop crumbs on the ground until they get there.
Sure. Can I say on the old book one, is there a place where many of those old books come from? Are they just any old book?
Yeah, I feel like you're guiding me again.
Yeah, I am. This is just this is a specific wording that is used for Circe. Circe clarifies it to say that it's the Western tradition primarily that is being drawn from for those old books.
Yeah, the Western canon.
Well, Western canon. Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Well, that's a more specific group. Like, you could read the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Like, I mean, I don't know. There's more stuff you could read that's outside of the Western tradition.
I read the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yeah, was it good?
Yeah, it was all right.
Okay. And is that why you're not teaching it in your 9th grade class? It might not be useful.
It sounds really cool. If you're Tibetan, I don't mean to insult you. But it's not what you were expecting.
Oh.
You're expecting like spells to raise the dead and That's not exactly
But
that.
I mean, so you could read the Bhagavad Gita, which is a famous Indian epic. So I don't know. I mean, there's old stuff that falls outside of the Western canon. I don't know.
And I think we tend towards the Western canon just because we are a Western culture, and it designs like it talks about where we came from.
Right.
And like we could involve the Eastern canon, but that would be a whole second thing of study.
This is why it fascinates me that there is a Christian classical school in mainland China that just started maybe about 2 years ago. And I just want to hear the stories about how that school goes about talking about Western civilization, but
I would
in China.
love it if they talked about Eastern. I mean, it would make sense in China to pick, instead of the Western canon, the Eastern canon, and then walk through those things.
Would that still be classical?
In the Eastern sense, yes.
Okay.
I think.
If it's still a Christian school, then then they have that different anthropology.
Sure.
And then you still have, so if you're a Christian school, I mean, you have to talk about Jerusalem. I mean, and in some sense, then you sort of have to talk about Europe because that was the cradle of Christendom for 1,000 years.
But there is a piece of classical education. AJ, I can never pronounce this correctly. What the series of speaking exercise that begins with a P?
Progymnasmata.
Progymnasmata.
Yeah. So, but
Progymnasmata.
the purpose of the progymnasmata. Nailed it.
I think I'm pronouncing it right. I never actually took a class.
Hey,
on this.
email us at classical stuff and tell us we got it wrong. But the purpose of those exercises was not just to do some exercises and be good at speaking, but it was to enter the life of politics, wasn't it? Like there was it was to prepare you to be a citizen at the end of those exercises, not just to.
Yeah, one of the last things you did was very much like our thesis,
Yeah.
right? You pick a law and you take a side.
Yeah. So like there's a piece of it where like if you're in China, you should be focused on things that prepare you well for China. And so many of those might be the same as they are in Veritas, but Austin is different than Shanghai, and they should be different. Right?
Is that a criteria of classical education? Is that it is preparing people to be citizens?
No, not right here. There's a second page that we probably won't get to about like implications of classical.
But I think that's an
definitely-
element of.
I think that is like yes, progymnasmata is the best example of that. But what people are being prepared for is civic life.
And that's why I'd say I'm kind of comfortable with a little bit Eurocentric method of teaching, just because you can get the full story of Western civilization, and it's a big story, right? It'd be hard to teach both Western and Eastern civ fully, but in an Eastern land like in China, I think Eastern civ makes sense to teach.
Yeah.
All right. Other aspects, other pieces of classical.
So I did material, I did methodology.
You got two. So
I did
Hamburger at 2 right now.
industrialized.
Graham's at 1. So
I'm thinking.
Graham, you want to?
My last two, I don't think they're going to be on your list.
Okay.
But we come at modern notions with a healthy skepticism.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
That's one that, like every modern trend in education, we don't just automatically like iPads. Yes, put them in every single kid's hand. Like
Fidget spinners makes your brain work better.
Yeah, so we come with skepticism to those things, and again, public schools do as well. It just depends on the school. And then the last was that it's we try as best we can to integrate the subjects. So
I like that.
I bring in history if I can to English. We line up the curriculum, so we're doing English and history. So while I'm talking about the Greeks, they are studying the Greeks. While I'm doing Julius Caesar, they are reading about the Romans. Right? We try to line those up as much as we can, because when the subject started, like the great painting masters, the first thing they learned was geometry.
Right. That integrated curriculum is talked about. It's not one of their big four things, but common features of classical education and integrated curriculum is usually a part of that. Graham, any more before I kind of spoil what's on this list?
So it's teaching virtue, the selection of material.
Yep.
Those are the two we have so far?
Yep. I split one of them into two. So your comment on like the people we're teaching are humans. They're not just receiving ideas, but then also the education of wisdom and virtue.
Latin.
There you go.
Is that one of them?
No.
Language focused?
Yes. That's a part of a bigger point. So classical education, I'll actually give this to you.
Yeah.
I'll give this to you, but at the end because it'll spoil the other one. So there's one more. I never would have guessed this one. So I'll just read it. Classical educators are logocentric. In a word, that means they believe that the world makes sense and that the sense it makes is knowable. They base their approach to education on discovering that sense, that everything is knowable. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I'd say that's true.
And like when you come to the books that you all teach, like there are things that these students are going to get out of it. It's not a useless exercise that is only for passing a test. There's like there's something in that book that they're going to receive if they like earnestly seek after it in that book. And like, I don't know, I would never like guess that as an element of classical education, but like it's a deeply hopeful thing of like the stuff we're doing is worthwhile.
That the world makes sense.
Yes.
And that we as creatures have the capacity to make sense of it.
Yes. Yes. And that's an important piece of it also, that we can make sense of it.
There's this, have you guys ended up reading the Father Brown Mysteries yet by Chesterton?
Not yet.
Oh man, listeners, they're so good.
I think it's on our bingo card for the summer to read some of those.
They're these little tiny, you can read one in 10 or 15 minutes, little vignette
they're that
stories.
short?
They're these little tiny mysteries.
That.
There's a bunch of them. You can like sit down and do one in an evening and then set it down for 3 months and then pick it up and not be lost.
Yeah.
Because it's just the same character in a bunch of different places. So he's this little traveling priest. His name is Father Brown. He looks really stupid. He's kind of clumsy. I'm not kidding. He's got a big round head. No one thinks he's very smart. And then he just turns out to be this incredible detective. And in one of the first stories, he's dealing with the famous French criminal, Flambeau, who sounds like a method of making food.
Right, yeah.
But Flambeau is pretending to be another priest on the trip with him. They like meet on the rail car because Father Brown is carrying this cross for the church that has sapphires all over it, right? It's this incredibly expensive cross. And he starts doing strange things, and the French detectives kind of pick up his trail and then eventually find them. And the two priests are sitting on the bench, and they're talking about theology and logic and reason, and Flambeau attacks reason, and he's like, and now I'm going to take that cross off of you, or I'm going to kill you. And he's like, no, you're not. And he's like, yes, I am. And he goes, no, first, because I don't have the cross. The box you're looking at is full of rocks and sticks. I left the cross in a store like yards and yards back, and I sent it back to the church in the mail. So it is gone already. And he's like, how did you know? And he says, well, when we were talking before, you attacked reason. That's just bad theology. The church gives the foundation for reason to really run free, because you can say our minds are not the end of happenstance, right? They didn't just come about randomly. They were created to do a certain thing, and they do that thing well. Yeah. And so the church, creation, gives a good foundation for reason, whereas evolution may not, right? Saying that my brain came about by a whole bunch of random mutations and accidents, and that at some point in the past I was not reasoning clearly, kind of puts you on shaky footing. It's like sawing up the branch that you're sitting on. Yeah. That's not totally fair, because we, in our experience reason to work consistently. But
you've used
it does put you on shaky ground.
Yeah, you use the analogy of that analysis can be helpful, that we should ask questions, but like there should be a foundation that we're getting down to. And then once you start chipping away the foundation, like, why are you asking questions? Like, it's no longer beneficial at that point.
Right.
You're left with nothing if you ask enough questions. Okay, so these are the elements that Cersei has for it, and I think are helpful to think about. Classical educators have a high view of humanity. Classical educators are logocentric. They believe that the world makes sense, and that the sense makes it knowable. So the world is knowable. Third, classical educators take responsibility for the Western tradition. So that was the Western canon comment that Hannenberg was talking about. And then kind of the implications of what we teach. This is what Graham was getting at. Classical educators teach in light of the three foregoing elements, which are the things I just said, leading to an emphasis on language, mathematics, and modes of teaching, governance, and assessment that support the rich goals of a classical education. So emphasis on language and mathematics. And by that, they mean the trivium and the quadrivium. So teaching those seven liberating arts. Other common features of classical education include the use of classical book.
Do either of you know how astronomy was done in the Middle Ages? Because, I mean, it was astronomy was a sorry, we're just getting...
We're recording in the middle of the day because we didn't have
school day.
And so people are barging into the room.
Where was I?
Astronomy.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I assume that astronomy, the way that we talk about it now, is not the same way as astronomy was taught in the Middle Ages. Was it more cosmology? I don't know. That's something that I personally want to learn more about, is when astronomy is considered a liberal art, what are they talking about? Because when I hear astronomy as a liberal art, I just think of looking at telescopes and like talking about burning balls of gas, and that just doesn't sound very liberating.
I need to find, because I was looking this up, and it was like I don't know.
I know Sherlock agrees with you.
What?
Sherlock Holmes doesn't learn about space. It doesn't help him solve crimes on Earth.
No, that's good, but he's very practical in that way, I guess.
I wish I could find.
Or at
Anyway.
least that's what the show.
Oh, here it is.
BBC show said.
So quadrivium is the teaching of number, which is arithmetic, number in space, which is geometry, number in time, which is music, number in space and time is astronomy.
The music of the spheres.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that means in terms of how it was taught itself, but it's just I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. That like even in the quadrivium, they are building on top of each other.
Yeah. Okay.
So I don't have better answers than that. Okay.
So space was like the final frontier of the quadrivium.
No, isn't theology? Theology is queen of the
that's
sciences.
Queen of the
Come on, man.
Sciences. That's right. Well, isn't there's that? What is that? Like Star Trek 7, where they like look for God or something? I don't know.
You made that up.
No, there's one where Spock's brother comes and he's like emotional.
I don't
Google it, friends.
Sorry.
I'm not crazy.
You crazy?
Was it a recent one?
No, it was like back in the 80s.
Is it the one where they ride that big pink wave?
Maybe.
Or is that just an episode of Next Generation?
I think you all make half this stuff up. Okay, so that's about a little more than half of our time on
The Undiscovered Country? Pretty sure that's the name of it. And Spock's brother's looking for God, and they find him.
I feel like we should move on.
All right, sure.
So that is an attempt at the definition of classical education. So as I think anyone listening can tell, there's not just this one very clear definition of it, but yeah, like there are many pieces to it, and so it's hard to like put into words all the aspects that go into classical education. So then I think,
I was going to say, go to any classical Christian school in the U.S., and you will find schools that are all dealing with this balance between classical and modern education, all in their own way. Like there's no, like, yes, there's always going to be looking to the trivium. There's always going to be the study of old books. But some schools will say, we don't have subjects. We're all going to do this together. Some schools will say, we will not go past, the 19th century in our literature. Some schools will say, everybody takes Latin, no questions asked. Or other schools have, no, as long as you're taking some sort of language, it doesn't have to be Latin. So, I don't know, it is kind of the Wild West of organization, that all of these schools are rediscovering or are looking at the education landscape saying we are losing something or we are missing something by just teaching skills and just teaching pragmatism and just teaching for accreditation for college.
Yeah.
Humanity is lost at some point. Western civilization is being ignored at a level. And then all these schools are going about their own ways of doing it. And it's kind of a fascinating thing. I don't know if I don't think it needs standardization. I think the fact that it's
that's interesting. Like because it is not easy to define, like that's the benefit of it.
Mm-hmm. And there's probably something that we do that is very Texan in the way that we go about the way our school runs, which is maybe a school in Virginia or a school in California doesn't.
Horse class.
Yeah.
Yeah, the required horse class that we have. How did you know?
Our marksmanship course.
Yeah, our six guns course. Dueling.
Yeah.
I don't think everybody else has those.
We should do an episode on our required classes. So that was kind of our attempt at defining classical education. So then for a little bit longer, I was hoping we could talk about an article by David Hicks in the Cersei Institute's magazine, where the question he asks is classical education still possible? Mm-hmm. Have you all read this article?
A long time ago.
Nope.
Good. So that makes this much more interesting. So I guess I'll just read the intro because it's short.
Do it.
Okay. I'm now old enough to look back on over half a century in the world of education as either a student or a teacher. It's hard to make this backward glance without cynicism or to look ahead without despair. All this time, the trend lines, by almost any standard measure, bent ever lower and lower, while the language of reform never failed to beat upon the ear. This world of education and all the reformers in it seem to divide themselves roughly into two groups. Those who believe that in technology, brain research, megadata, or some research-based breakthrough, we will discover new tools and approaches that will revolutionize the way we learn and teach. And those who believe that recovering the lost tools of learning will spark another renaissance and turn those trend lines around. He then has a little bit more to say about how kind of that second option encompasses a lot of groups, but among them he includes classical education and some homeschooling communities. And then his answer is that classical education is not possible in the current environment. And he has 4 reasons for that. What's that?
What are they?
Let's go through them. So reason number 1 is that when the classical method was being used in ancient Greece, there was a conception that man had 2 parts to him. that man was both the present material, like this present material reality, but also there was an eternal part to him. And so, yes, the skills and yes, the now mattered, but what was far more important was the eternal because it lasted longer. And so that's where the importance of virtue comes from, that it's not just the thing I'm doing right now, but it's who I'm going to be for a very, very long time in the future. So by losing that sense of a human being two things, classical education is not possible.
Because we just think that human beings are just matter?
Just the matter, just the material.
But that's where Christian classical education is different because, like we were talking about earlier, it has this different anthropology that man is made in God's image and is the eternal. So I guess it can't be done in a culture that thinks man is just like a big walking bag of electric meat. But it can in a community that, like you said, has this high view of man.
Sure. I definitely agree with that. AJ, any...
So that's why when there are classical schools that don't have a religious component or don't have a strong statement of like what a human person is, when push comes to shove, those are going to be interesting dynamics on the inside of like how they make administrative choices.
Yeah.
I don't know. Someone's joked that Christian schools, they have statements of faith that parents need to sign or that all the stakeholders need to sign. But that Christian classical schools should also have statements of classical education, statements of belief that also need to be assigned and adhered to, or else we're all coming at it from a different idea as to what is the goal or what is the person. I don't know.
I think there's something to be said for that. I mean, that's kind of what he's getting at with this first problem, is that you need people who agree in these two parts of a person. Mm-hmm. But like...
Now, the student doesn't have to agree because the kid doesn't know what he is. No, I'm serious. Like, as you're aging and growing up, like, so the student doesn't have to be on board with all this.
Yeah.
Because the reasoning is that if a human person actually is a creature made in God's image, then what we do should work.
Yes. I agree with that.
Regardless of whether the student conceptually agrees with it or not.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't matter if a rose bush thinks it's not a rose bush, but if you're doing all the rose bush things and it's starting to blossom roses, then
it'll grow. Yeah. Whatever it believes about itself.
That may be true up to a certain point for a child. Like, when they become an adult, you still don't want them thinking that they're just electric meat, because that will eventually play out on how they think about morality or how they think about other people.
Yeah, and so it's possible to get parents who are on board with it. And that's what Veritas is. It's like a community of people who are on board with both, I'm a human right now, but I'm also going to exist for a very long time in the future. And so they're on board with that. But there is a complication of everything that's communicated to the student being your actions kind of don't matter. Or you can be immoral and that's fine. And you'll still get praise for it. I don't know. There are things that we can teach at school that are contradicted by what they're hearing outside of school. And then at least that makes classical education more difficult. Mm-hmm. You might disagree.
No, I agree. So the way I'm thinking about this is, I don't know that public education believes only that we are electric meat, or at least not everyone involved in public education does, because there are, everyone has different religions and you have to deal with all of those things. And so it's not necessarily everyone in the system, but the system, to be a public system and to deal with all of that, has to do one of two things. Either go to the lowest common denominator and disregard every single piece of that, which is, I think, why we lose art and drama and that sort of curriculum, is because we are going to the base skills that are needed to make a person functioning in society. Not necessarily a good citizen, but a citizen, right? Some sort of piece that can fit into the puzzle. Or you have to insist that those elements are like highly regulated, and everyone kind of has to agree to some extent on the way in which those things will come into schools. Which is why we have laws against proselytization by teachers, and why you see prayer disappearing from schools, and why there's this separation of church and state thing, and why there's a lot of controversy around that. But even so, we are still getting some sort of dogma about who we are as human beings, right? We can define our own reality, which assumes that there is no external reality, and that morals are only a thing made up in the mind of man. So I see it going one of two ways. Either there's an underlying kind of ethos that is insisted upon and everyone kind of signs up for, but then quibbles over, or you just delete it altogether. What was the last bit you guys were just talking about before I sort of said that? You were talking about, I had a two-part thing I was going to say. I forget where you were right before I jumped
Material and eternal parts of a person. That the student is taught one thing here, but they hear a message outside of the school that contradicts it.
So two things there. Remember that medieval man did believe that we were soul, but that the soul was reached by kind of a smoke given off by the blood. So he also believed that there was a scientific component to the soul, right? Just like there are Christians who probably believe that the eternal soul is perhaps a function of the brain, right? And the brain is electricity in meat. But there is still something going on there. Just like with a computer, if you point out that it has components, doesn't mean it can't run programs and do a job and be something more than just a pile of electric plastic, right? So there's that. And then the external pressures of society. Sorry, I'm kind of going on a rant
Go
here.
for it. That's fine.
But I definitely feel that pressure in class, right? When it comes to talking about relativism, when it comes to talking about even spirituality and God, and talking to kids who grew up in Christian homes, right? I actually chatted with a couple of my students, and they said, what I hear from you is one thing, but what I hear from everybody else is that your thing is ridiculous. Yep. And my response was maybe a little heavy-handed, but it was that, and they decided to kind of land in the middle. He's like, why don't I just kind of split the difference and say I can't know and be agnostic. And I said, well, if you take that tack in every societal trend, right? The Nazis said that the Jews were vermin and were good to be exterminated, and perhaps your pastor was saying that's a horrible way to look at humans and human beings. Yeah. And if you split the difference, then where you end is racism, right? You say that the Jews are subhuman, but maybe not vermin, right? So that is where you can end if you capitulate to societal trends, right? This is why the reading of old books, classical education is so important, is because every society has its own tendencies and problems, right? We think because we are progressive, we don't make the mistakes of the past, or we have no holes or flaws. But I think the way we have been treating each other for the past several years bears out that is not necessarily true.
Yeah. I guess we talked about that last time with like the view of things improving over time versus kind of time being cyclical. That we can still learn things from classical materials. I don't know. I like the school a lot. That's just not the only thing I'm thinking right now. Any other comments on the first pillar? Kind of this loss of an idea of man being both, body and spirit is, I guess,
Just that I don't know how schools... So the reason why schools are always such a sort of a touch point in society is it's because it's where three of the biggest drivers of a civilization or of a city, a polis, a people meet. It's where the family and the state and religion
and Netflix
all come together, right? So you have families who want something for their child. You have the state that wants something for their citizens, and then you have religion, which is making statements about telos, about the end and what you should be. And so if you have a school that is going to sort of try to be all to all, you are going to have this, like you said, the lowest common denominator thing. And so there has to be this kind of like low grade piece between all of these three components: the family, the state, and ideologies and faiths and religion. Yeah. And I just don't know how long that piece can last. And this is what you see. You see these things flare up when there are these controversial things that either the families want the school to do, or the state wants the school to do, or religion wants the school to do. When I was a kid, that was when saying the Lord's Prayer during assemblies was I remember doing it, and then I remember it not, and then I remember it being no longer done. I don't know. So that's just, I don't know how schools that don't have that just go lowest common denominator will survive. Yeah, frankly.
Sure.
So, Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to keep going with the
Second
next
pillar.
point.
Yeah, next pillar.
Okay. So I think I might just list these next three, and then if there's one, I think there's one of those three that y'all will want to talk about, but maybe not. So his second pillar that is missing from, I guess, society, from culture, that makes classical education either much more difficult or not possible, is that follows from this, so from that first pillar, that our modern approach to science and the study of the natural world is decidedly not classical. We study not to understand the natural world in order to shape our lives and societies around the requirements of nature, but in order to manipulate and improve upon nature for our own comfort and profit.
So we're too much of the technocracy is his argument that we
don't study stuff for the sake of studying stuff. We study stuff so that we can so with science...
Use it or break it?
Yes, that. Yes. And so it's what we want is what shapes how we use the stuff around us, not understanding stuff so that we can shape ourselves. Is that... Mm-hmm. And which ties in with that first one of I don't need to change myself if I'm just the material person, so I might as well just be comfortable. And so a tool of that is science. And that is a modern conception. The third is the loss of a telos, a loss of an ideal person. He has a quote in his Physics. Aristotle says the end. And anyway, sorry, the loss of a telos. There's no thing that we're working these students toward. I'm not sure I agree with that one. I just think the telos has changed.
I think the telos has changed. It would be self-actualization or some sort of self-determination. You choose what you want to make you happy.
Yeah, vaguely success. And I think success as it is defined by each individual person, probably.
Which is why a lot of, I think, students or adults feel a big cognitive dissonance or some sort of big letdown post-college, because you're sort of passing the telos buck while the kids are there. Why am I doing this in elementary school? Well, because ninth grade is going to be hard, and I'm preparing you for that. Okay. Right. Why am I doing this in ninth grade? Well, I'm preparing you for junior year when you need to think about colleges. Why am I doing this in junior year? Well, in a couple of years, you're going to be in college, and that's going to be a big deal. Then you're in college. Why am I doing this? Well, you need to get a job, and you need to make money someday. And then you get a job, and you make money. Why am I doing this? I don't know. Figure it out.
Right.
And then people feel like, ooh, I've been playing this script, and I've been sort of shuffling along this path that were plausible answers when I was young, but the ending is nothing.
Right. Or you're not in as successful a job as you would want it. Right. You're welding, but you don't have a good welding job. You've got kind of a mediocre welding job, and either way, it isn't making you happy. Or you did get the good job, and that still isn't making you happy, and so you're in this weird impasse.
Mm-hmm. And then the fourth pillar, final one. Above all, a classical education is about preserving and passing on the culture's norms for individual and social behavior. Education, paideia, as the ancients understood and practiced it, indeed, as all teachers and schools until the 20th century understood it, was overwhelmingly about transferring the norms of civilization from one generation to the next. There were norms for everything, and he goes through a long list. But we no longer are teaching those norms to our next generation. And so we're not teaching. So actually, I might go through this.
Again, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think the norm we do teach is the norm of iconoclasm. The norm we teach is the norm of question everything, rip it down, rip the system, revolution, progress.
I think that combined with, I think the more overwhelming one is tolerance, acceptance. I think that is probably
smashing
the
paradigms.
Teaching,
Isn't
right?
smashing paradigms hailed as a great good of the modern world? Look at this person. They came in and they questioned everything, and they defied what everybody thought they were going to be, and now they started this new movement of them. I don't know,
for the sake of acceptance and goodness.
Yeah. Okay.
So he says almost exactly that. A classical education is unthinkable outside of a normative framework, yet as I've written elsewhere, it's hard to think of a single segment of modern life in which denorming has not become the norm. Art, music, fashion, language, manners, beliefs. What would have been regarded as outside the norm, if not beyond the pale 50 years ago, is now common currency and hardly provokes notice. No longer...
Deconstructing is the word of the academics.
Yeah. So those are all four of them, which then leads us to the end where he says, I'll say what he says in a second. Are you all, do you all buy these four?
I think so. I think what he's So this is why I think classical education, Christian classical education, can only happen in this small localized community of like-minded individuals. I don't think we can replicate what Veritas Academy is doing nationwide. I think it is, in many ways, it's kind of like, well, if you want to go there, it's kind of like Dreyer's Benedict option,
yes.
Or these small localized communities, resident aliens. We are people that believe man is different than the predominant culture that we find ourselves in, and we are going to cultivate that vision of what man is, that kingdom of what God, of God's kingdom in a school, in a community, in a people, in up and against the culture around it. So it is kind of like a sort of a subversive and alien thing.
Sure.
So can you read them one more time? The four?
All four?
Yeah.
So the first pillar is that there is both an eternal and present reality of a man. So there's a body and there's a soul. The second is that we study in order to manipulate, not in order to understand. 3 is the loss of telos, the loss of a kind of a purpose that we're working toward with each person. And then 4, that instead of teaching norms, we're teaching the breaking of norms. They're no longer norms that we can pass on from generation to generation.
While I agree that it would be hard to replicate this form of education on any large scale, and I agree with most of the things you said, Graham, I am skeptical of any big generalizations like that.
Sure.
And I think there are obvious breaks in each of those. The first was, or the last one, what we teach is a breaking of norms. Well, that's one of the norms that we teach, but we also teach a lot of other ones, that you should be productive, that you should study hard, that you should be diligent, that
your life's greatest
tolerant.
fulfillment is your sexual prowess and satisfaction. That is a norm of society today.
Yeah, or that you get to define your own person in almost every degree, right? These are all norms that are being passed on. And so to say that we are passing on only the breaking of norms, if that were true, we would be in complete and utter chaos. We at least have some still semblance of like societal drift, I think. What was number 1 again?
The loss of belief in both the present and the eternal part of a person.
But see, that's not true of everyone. I'd say that's true of a good chunk of society, but I think, like, if you were to look at the census data and find out how many of us believed in a higher power and believed in some sort of spirituality, I think that number is incredibly high, even though what we see on the airwaves is probably not, doesn't testify to that. But there's a great subset of like people in the United States who are either Christian or some other type of religion that does believe in an eternal soul or some type of.
But they would say, all right, it would not surprise me if they said, and talking about that or thinking about that has no real place in a school. Like, a school is not a place to talk about the eternal part. So I remember, when I was a kid, Christian family, went to public school, and basically was just kind of like, my parents, it was kind of like a hold your nose kind of situation. When they're talking about things that we don't believe as a family, you just know that we don't believe this as a family. And hold your nose while you're doing it.
And so that's a symptom of what I said earlier, was that if you are going to function as a public school that has to deal with everyone believing something different, either you have to get rid of all that or find some way to coexist with it. And that's what you guys were doing.
But then he's saying that...
No, that statement is that this is the way our society is drifting, I believe. And I'm not sure that is true of each of those statements, right? There are, I think, big caveats, and it's a kind of doom and gloom look about where we are headed as a society, sure. But I am always wary of big sweeping statements like that. And I mean, he would probably explain it away incredibly well, and I haven't read the entire article. But
I mean, his quote, "The modern world, on the other hand, places man exclusively in time and rejects the notion of an eternal soul."
Not true.
He's making a broad...
Yeah, that's a broad generalization that I'm not sure census data would bear up.
Yeah. Yes, I think there are quibbles with each one. Would you disagree that, like, I don't know, just from the culture that they're exposed to or the things that they're consuming, like, I don't know, are they consuming things that are about, like, I want to make myself a better person and, like, develop my soul, or is it I want to be happy and pleased right now?
I think there's a mix. I have a friend who posted today about, meta meditation, where it's a 3-step process. You send good vibes to your friends, you send good vibes to your enemies, you send good vibes to yourself. And that was almost based entirely upon spiritual components, right? So that is mixed with I'm going to get mine thing on Facebook, but I also see posts about people saying like, here are some things that are not okay, and we should do our best to make them better. And then, people support them. So I think it's a mix, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that all of the internet, aside from the ads, is designed at, I am going to fulfill myself and my sexuality always and only. I'm not sure that's true.
Yeah. Yeah. In a weird way, my thoughts on this whole thing ends up really close to what AJ is saying. So like, I think for classical education to be anything other than like a history lesson, it has to be paired, and Graham said this earlier, I think it has to be paired with the Christian aspect as well. And so, AJ, what you basically just said is that like you need a certain worldview to get something out of classical education, and I think that's largely the Christian worldview. And I think that's why classical and Christian have gone together so well, which is kind of weird because the Greeks were pagan, but anyway. So, yeah. It's easy to be negative on everything. There is a hope. I do think there's a certain worldview necessary to get something out of a classical education. I think that's the Christian. And that's actually how David Hicks ends the article. So he says, so are we to teach the young or bring children into this world to throw up our hands in despair? By no means. We who call ourselves Christians are still charged with the responsibility to raise our children in the fear of God and educate them to treat the natural world with utmost respect, to live in pursuit of the ends for which all men and women are created, and to order their lives in accordance with biblical norms. But no one should assume this charge lightly, believing that a classical education, whether understood as Greek or Latin or great books, a curriculum or a method, will somehow accomplish this task for us. This might have been the case were the ground and the pillars for a classical education in place, but as I hope I've shown in this essay, this is not the case. The pillars are toppled and the ground sown with salt, as thoroughly as the Romans destroyed Carthage. This requires us to make a sober estimation of the challenge we face. How are we to meet this challenge in an increasingly invasive, relentless, and hostile environment? There you go. There's a hope.
So one of my big questions is what are we to tell to our listeners who do not have kids in school or are not teachers themselves? Like what can our non-education related listeners take from this?
Yeah, so sorry, this is you'll probably get more out of the first 40 minutes, which is the definition of classical education. Maybe the last part was just for people who attend one. Yeah,
I mean, just in general.
So some people who find the podcast are here because they want to explore classical things in the study of history, which is awesome. Like, please listen for that. You will learn about Homer. You will learn about Dante. Like, stick on, you'll enjoy it. But for some people who are listening, they're either a part of Veritas or they go to a classical school or they homeschool and want to incorporate classical elements. I think it's just these four pillars are important to classical education working. So.
And I think maybe, like, if you're listening to our podcast, then you clearly want to educate yourself somehow.
Right.
And so maybe knowing where you stand on what that means for the way you function in the world, just as the way a classical educated school has to function in the world, right? If your perspectives are anywhere similar to ours, it means that you are going to meet with opposition just in your everyday life. And so knowing what that means and how to meet that and why you think the way you do is always important, I guess. Maybe?
Yep. I think there are many practices that can flow out of theory, so I don't want to limit those.
Yeah.
So I'd actually be curious to hear, I don't know, what anyone has gotten from this.
Yeah.
By emailing.
By emailing us at classicalstuff@veritasacademy.net.
Yep.
So yeah, email us and tell us why you listen. Why do you listen to classical stuff?
I would love that.
Should know. That would be really fascinating.
I'm still waiting for someone to just send, I don't.
Yeah.
How do they know? Anyway.
And you can find us at classicalstuff.net. I've said the email address. We have a Twitter page, which is some butchering of the word classical stuff, classical stuff.
There it is.
At Twits. You can quote at us.
And it was on Twitter and in email that I was told it is not a Tennessee Yankee in King Arthur's Court. It's a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court.
So this is by far our most popular classical stuff we got wrong. Many people have written in and
they had a lot of feelings.
There were
so many feelings.
To tell
there
us that
people.
there are not many Yankees in Tennessee.
Hey, come on. I'm from Washington State. I'm from the Northwest. I have no dog in this fight. I do not know where the Yankees come from.
I'm Canadian. You're all Southerners. Anyway, so yes, that was the classical stuff we got wrong. It was a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, not a Tennessee Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Don't know if those exist. And we thank you for listening. This is AJ, Thomas, and I'm Graham signing off.
Bye.
Signing off and ciao. Bye.